Welcome everyone. I'm excited to kick off our presentation today. We'll be exploring an in-depth look at the tax system established by Spain during over 3 centuries of colonial rule in the Philippine Islands. This covers its structure, key taxes, revolts, and major reforms. Over the next few slides, we'll delve into how these taxes shaped history, society, and the economy during that period. Let's get started. Now, let's take a closer look at the legal framework that supported Spanish rule over the Indies. The Real y Supremo Consejo de las Indias, or the Royal and Supreme Council of the Indies, was the key institution responsible for enacting laws on behalf of the Spanish monarch. These laws covered many aspects of colonial administration and governance. They were compiled in a significant collection called the Recopilación de Leyes de los Reinos de las Indias, which translates to the collection of laws of the kingdoms of the Indies. This was a comprehensive 4-volume set published in Madrid back in 1861, serving as an important legal reference for governing the colonies. This legal framework was crucial because it affirmed Spain's sovereignty over its colonies, establishing the authority of the Spanish crown in these territories. It also included laws that financed the costs associated with pacification, meaning the efforts to maintain order and governance, ensuring the colonies remained under Spanish control. During Spain's more than 3 centuries of rule over the Philippine Islands, the Spanish government established a structured tax system. The primary purpose of this system was to generate revenue, funds needed to maintain the administration and support various colonial activities. Taxation during this period served 2 main objectives. First, to raise the necessary money to support the colony's governance, and second, to help finance the costs related to maintaining peace and order. In summary, this overview of the Spanish colonial revenue system highlights how legal authority and taxation worked hand in hand to sustain and reinforce Spanish rule over the Philippines and other colonies in the Indies. Now, let's take a closer look at the taxes that formed the backbone of the Spanish colonial economy in the Philippines. These taxes made up the central or insular revenue system that kept Spanish rule afloat. Essentially, they were levied on the Filipino population, and their main purpose was to generate funds to support the operations of the colonial government. What's important to note here is that these taxes weren't just about raising money. They also played a significant role in maintaining Spanish control and influence over the islands. In this slide, we'll focus on the 5 key taxes during the Spanish period. Understanding these helps us see how the colonial government financed its activities, from governance to religion and defense. So, as we go through each one, keep in mind how these taxes interconnected with the broader theme of colonial rule and economic control. The tribute was arguably the most hated of all Spanish taxes. Its collection was often marred by abuses from tax collectors, who sometimes imposed rates beyond what was legally allowed. This made the tribute a symbol of colonial oppression, fueling discontent among the Filipino population. In fact, it was a major catalyst for several revolts throughout the colonial period. The good news is, it was eventually abolished by the tax reform of 1884, which replaced it with the cedula tax. Now the tribute was collected in various forms, which made it both flexible and inescapable. It could be paid in cash, agricultural produce, livestock, or labor services. This variety meant that pretty much everyone had some form of obligation to pay, regardless of their resources. So how was it collected? The tribute was an annual tax imposed specifically on adult Filipino males. It was a significant source of revenue for the Spanish government, but also one of the most burdensome obligations placed on the indigenous population. It was a heavy burden, both financially and socially, that left a lasting impact on Filipino society during the colonial era. Now, let's take a closer look at the sanctorum. Essentially, this was a form of religious tax that was levied on the yearly income of the clergy and religious orders. Its main purpose was to support the activities of the Catholic Church and its clergy who were operating throughout the Philippine archipelago. You can think of it as a financial backbone that helped sustain the Church's work across the islands. It's also important to note how deeply intertwined the Catholic Church was with the Spanish colonial administration. The Sanctorum played a crucial role in ensuring a steady stream of financial support for the Church's extensive network, which included parishes, missions, and various religious institutions spread across the Philippines. So, in summary, the Sanctorum wasn't just a simple tax. It was a key element in maintaining the Church's influence and operations during the colonial period, reinforcing the strong relationship between the Church and the Spanish rulers. This connection helped shape many aspects of colonial society and governance. Now, let's take a closer look at the practice surrounding the donativo. Although it was technically called a voluntary contribution, in reality, the local populations often faced a different story. They were expected to contribute, and this was usually done under the watchful eye of colonial authorities, which raises questions about how voluntary it truly was. The funds collected through the donativo were used for a variety of colonial priorities. These included funding public projects and infrastructure development, which were essential for maintaining control and improving living conditions. They also supported Spanish military operations, helping to secure colonial interests. Additionally, the donativo financed other government-designated community needs, covering a broad range of priorities dictated by the colonial system. So, while the term voluntary might suggest free will, in practice, the donativo was a tool for colonial authorities to fund key initiatives, often relying on local populations' contributions, whether truly voluntary or not, to sustain their control and development efforts. Now, let's take a closer look at the concept of the Caja de Comunidad. Essentially, this was a communal fund established in each town or community across the Philippines. Its main role was to serve as a local treasury that could finance various community needs, public services, and local projects at the barangay or town level. This fund was crucial because it acted as a financial buffer for the town, helping to cover essential services such as local public works, infrastructure, community services, and welfare programs. It also played a vital role in addressing emergency needs of the town, especially during times of crisis or unforeseen events. What's particularly interesting about the Caja de Comunidad is that it was one of the few tax mechanisms that was ostensibly directed toward benefiting the local community directly, rather than being controlled by the central colonial government. Residents of each town contributed to this fund, and local officials usually managed it. However, while it was intended to serve the community, in practice, its management was not immune to issues. Like other parts of the colonial tax system, it was sometimes subject to abuses. Despite this, the Caja de Comunidad remained an important institution because it represented a collective effort by the residents to support their local needs and development. In the broader context of colonial society, it highlights how local communities sought to organize their resources for their own benefit, even within a system often characterized by centralized control and oversight. Now, let's take a look at some of the key projects during the Spanish colonial period. One of the most important aspects was shipbuilding at royal shipyards, especially in Cavite. These shipyards were vital because they supported Spanish military campaigns by producing the ships needed for defense and expansion. Building ships was a major undertaking that helped maintain Spanish control over the islands. In addition to military efforts, the Spanish also focused on constructing churches, fortifications, and other colonial infrastructure. For example, the walls of Intramuros were built to protect the city from invasions. These structures not only served strategic purposes, but also symbolized Spanish authority and influence. Moving on, the construction and maintenance of roads, bridges, and government buildings were also crucial. These public works helped improve communication, transportation, and administration across the colony, making governance more efficient and supporting economic activities. Finally, I want to mention the system of forced labor called servicio personal. This was a system where indigenous people were required to work unpaid for the Spanish government for a certain number of days each year. The labor was mainly used for building projects, maintenance, and other public works. While it was a form of forced labor, it played a significant role in the development of colonial infrastructure and defense. All of these projects, shipbuilding, construction, and forced labor, were interconnected efforts to solidify Spanish control and develop the colony's infrastructure, shaping the history of the Philippines during that era. Let's take a closer look at the 5 main taxes during the Spanish colonial period. First, we have the tribute, which was the primary source of revenue for the colonial government. This was an annual tax on adult Filipino males, and it could be paid in cash, produce, livestock, or labor. It's important to understand that this was a significant burden on the local population. Next, there's the sanctorum, a religious tax imposed on the yearly income of clergy and religious orders. The purpose of this tax was to support the Catholic Church, which played a central role in colonial society. Moving on, we have the donativo, which consisted of voluntary contributions from the local people. These donations were used for public projects, infrastructure, and military support. Although voluntary, these contributions often became a necessary way to support community needs. Then we have the Caja de Comunidad, a communal fund established in each town. This fund was managed by local officials and was used to finance community needs and public services, fostering a sense of local cooperation. Finally, we come to servicio personal, which involved forced unpaid labor. This labor was imposed on the indigenous population and was used for public works, construction, and military projects. While it was unpaid, it was a way for the colonial government to mobilize local labor for their projects. Together, these taxes and labor systems show how the Spanish colonial government relied on both monetary and unpaid labor to sustain their control and development efforts. Now, let's delve into the second part of our discussion. The oppressive nature of Spanish taxation, especially the tribute and forced labor, really sparked a series of armed uprisings throughout the Philippine archipelago. These revolts were some of the earliest and most significant ways Filipinos expressed their resistance against colonial rule. When the Spanish imposed tribute, it wasn't just about money. It symbolized their control and exploitation. Forced labor, on the other hand, forced Filipinos into grueling work under harsh conditions, often without fair compensation. These injustices fueled anger and rebellion among the people. The revolts against the tribute were not isolated incidents. They represented a collective effort to challenge and push back against Spanish authority. These uprisings laid the groundwork for future movements and demonstrated the Filipino spirit of resistance from the very beginning of colonial rule. The rebels were granted pardon, and as a result, the Philippine tax system underwent important reforms. These revolts were actually the first indigenous uprisings against the hated tribute and the corrupt tax collectors who enforced it. Although these early revolts were quickly suppressed, we see that similar revolts would continue in the following years, showing that Filipino resistance to unfair taxation was far from over. In terms of outcome, Governor-General Santiago de Vera sent Spanish and Filipino troops to put down the rebellion. Eventually, the government forces managed to quell the revolt, restoring order for the time being. A notable point in Spanish response was when the natives killed 6 tax collectors from Vigan, which marked a significant escalation in resistance against colonial authorities. Looking at the key event in 1589, revolts erupted in Cagayan and Dingras, areas that are now part of Cagayan and Ilocos Norte in Luzon. The Ilocanos, Ibanags, and other Filipino groups rebelled mainly because they believed the tax collectors were abusing their power, imposing high taxes beyond what was legally allowed. To give some background, these revolts in Cagayan and Dingras in 1589 reflected growing frustrations with the tribute system, which many saw as unjust and exploitative. These early uprisings highlight how resistance to colonial rule and unfair taxation was an ongoing issue and a sign of the broader struggle for justice and autonomy. On June 1, 1649, Agustin Sumuroy, a Waray from Palapag in what we now call northern Samar, took a stand. He and his followers launched an armed uprising against the Spaniards. The main reason for their rebellion was the implementation of the Polo y Servicio, which was a forced labor system that the Spaniards imposed on the local communities. This system was deeply unpopular because it forced Filipinos to work without pay, often under harsh conditions. Sumuroy's revolt, which lasted from 1649 to 1650, is an important example of how local resistance grew in response to Spanish policies. It highlights the broader theme of Filipino resistance against colonial rule and their fight for freedom and justice. In June 1650, the capture and execution of Agustin Sumuroy marked a turning point in the revolt, leading to the eventual defeat of the rebels. His co-conspirator, David Dula, continued fighting after Sumuroy's death, but he was wounded in fierce battles with the Spaniards. Ultimately, Dula was captured and executed in Palapag, northern Samar, along with 7 of his key lieutenants. Despite these losses, the rebels had already shown significant organization and ambition by establishing a rebel government in the mountains of Samar. This was more than a simple uprising. It demonstrated their determination to create a structured resistance. The revolt spread across various regions, including Cebu, Masbate, and Camiguin, as well as Bicol, Camarines, and Albay, and even reached Zamboanga in Mindanao and Surigao. This geographic spread shows how quickly the rebellion grew beyond its initial roots. The roots of this revolt can be traced back to a specific trigger: town mayors sending warriors to Cavate's shipyards for forced labor. This action directly violated Manila's orders that natives under the Polo system should not be taken far from their hometowns. The rebellion was also marked by violent acts, including the murder of the parish priest of Palapag, which underscored the depth of unrest and resistance. In summary, Sumuroy's revolt was fueled by grievances over forced labor and local injustices, and its rapid spread across the archipelago reflected the widespread discontent with Spanish colonial rule. This revolt was a significant turning point because it marked the start of a more violent and widespread uprising. It didn't stay confined to one area. It quickly spread to the neighboring province of Pangasinan. This expansion brought in new leaders and broadened the scope of Filipino resistance against Spanish colonial exploitation. Now, if we look at the wider impact, the Kapampongans faced very unfair working conditions. They were forced to work for 8 months without any pay, not even for the rice they sold to the colonial government. These abuses caused a strong sense of injustice among them. In response, they took a bold step, setting their campsite on fire, which ignited the armed conflict and sparked further resistance. Focusing on the causes and key events, in 1660, we see Francisco Maniego, a Kapampangan leader, leading an uprising in Pampanga. His fight was against the tribute, forced labor, and the exploitation related to rice. This revolt, known as Francisco Maniego's Revolt, lasted from 1660 to 1661 and symbolized the growing resistance of Filipinos against Spanish oppression. Overall, these events highlight how local grievances and injustices fueled larger movements for independence, shaping the fight for freedom that would continue in the years to come. Malong aspired to become the king of Pangasinan, having assisted many Spaniards in governing different towns in the province. He initially abandoned this plan when war broke out in Pampanga, but ultimately answered Maniego's call to arms. He led the people of Pangasinan in an armed uprising against the Spaniards and proclaimed himself the king of Pangasinan, one of the most dramatic acts of defiance against Spanish colonial authority in 17th century Philippines. During the 1660s, Malong served as Maestro de Campo in Binalatongan, which is now known as San Carlos City. He was persuaded by Maniego to revolt against the Spaniards because he and others had experienced similar abuses under the colonial system. This period, from 1660 to 1661, is known as Andres Malong's Revolt, and it marked a significant chapter in our history of resistance. Malong's actions, including claiming the title of king, were bold and dramatic steps in challenging Spanish rule. His story highlights the growing unrest and desire for independence among Filipinos during this era, connecting to the larger theme of resistance against colonial domination. Let's take a closer look at the 4 major revolts that shaped our history. First, we have Malong's Revolt, which took place around 1660 to 1661. Andres Malong led an uprising in Pangasinan, proclaiming himself as the king of Pangasinan. This revolt was actually inspired by Maniago's call to arms, showing how leadership and inspiration played crucial roles in these uprisings. Next, there's Maniago's revolt, also between 1660 and 1661. The Kapampongans in Pampanga rebelled against the injustices of tribute, forced labor, and rice exploitation. What's significant here is that this rebellion lasted for about 8 months of unpaid work, indicating the strong resentment against economic exploitation. Then we move on to Sumuroy's revolt, which happened from 1649 to 1650. The Wares in Samar rose up against forced labor, known locally as Polo y Servicio. This revolt was quite widespread, spreading across multiple regions, and even led to the establishment of a rebel government in the Samar Mountains. It highlights how communities fought back against oppressive systems. Finally, we have the Cagayan and Dingras revolts in 1589. The Ilocanos and Ibanags rebelled against abusive tribute collectors, and notably, 6 tax collectors were killed. These uprisings marked the first indigenous efforts against the tribute system, showing a growing resistance among local communities. Overall, these revolts reflect the widespread desire for justice and resistance against exploitation during those times. They each had unique causes and outcomes, but shared a common theme of resistance against oppressive rule. Part 3 of our discussion highlights one of the most significant reforms that Spain introduced in the 19th century, which is the tax reform of 1884. This reform was a major turning point because it fundamentally restructured the colonial tax system. It aimed to make things a bit more fair for the Filipino population by eliminating the most hated tax of that time. This was a big step toward reducing the economic burden on Filipinos, who had been heavily taxed for years. Additionally, the reform also reduced the forced labor requirements that had been an oppressive aspect of colonial rule. By doing so, Spain was trying to soften its control and make the system somewhat more humane, or at least less harsh. Overall, this reform connects to the broader theme of how colonial powers attempted to manage their colonies, sometimes through reform, sometimes through control. In this case, the 1884 tax reform marked a move towards easing some of the colonial burdens, though it still kept much of the system intact. It's an important example of how colonial administrations responded to internal and external pressures for change. The tax reform of 1884 came after nearly 3 centuries of Filipino resistance against the tribute system. This long history of pushback shows how deeply the local population felt about the burdens imposed on them. The abolition of the tribute and the reduction of forced labor represented a belated acknowledgement by the Spanish crown that the existing system was no longer sustainable and had caused widespread unrest among Filipinos. One of the key changes was the introduction of the cedula personals, which created a more standardized, identity-based tax system. This new system applied not only to Filipinos, but also to Spaniards and foreigners residing in the islands, broadening the tax base and making it more systematic. The Royal Decree of March 6, 1884, outlined 2 major provisions. First, the despised tribute was abolished and replaced by the cedula tax, which aimed to make taxation more organized and less oppressive. Second, the annual forced labor, known as polo, was reduced from 40 days to just 15 days, easing the burden on the Filipino workers. These reforms marked a significant turning point in Spanish colonial taxation policies, reflecting a recognition of the need to modify the system that had long caused unrest, and moving towards a more structured and, hopefully, more acceptable approach. On this slide, I want to highlight the unique nature of the 10th class, which was called the gratis class. This class was special because it exempted certain groups, specifically priests, soldiers, and other privileged individuals, from paying the cedula tax altogether. It's an important point because it shows how the tax system had built-in privileges for those in power or with certain social statuses. Now, when we look at the bigger picture, there were actually 16 different classes of cedulas. Originally, 9 of these classes had specific tax rates, ranging from 1.5 pesos up to 25 pesos. But then, we have this 10th gratis class, which was unique because it was completely exempt from taxes. It's also interesting to note the groups that fell into this exempted category. For example, the Chinese paid a separate poll tax, and some groups like the remontados and infieles, those not under local administration, as well as natives and colonists from places like Jolo, Balabac, and Palawan, had their own specific arrangements. Lastly, I want to emphasize the scope of the cedula system itself. According to the royal decree, everyone living in the islands, whether they were Spaniards, foreigners, or natives, had to obtain a cedula if they were over 18 years old. This was a way to keep track of the population and maintain control over the diverse communities within the archipelago. So overall, this slide helps us understand how the tax system was structured to include different classes, privileges, and exemptions, all as part of the broader effort to regulate and organize colonial society. So here we see that the tribute system was abolished and replaced by something called cedula personals. This was part of the broader reforms aimed at modifying how taxes and forced labor were enforced. Forced labor, or polo, was also reduced significantly, from 40 days down to just 15 days per year, which was a notable change. Taxation was now applied to all residents above 18, regardless of whether they were Spaniards, foreigners, or natives, making the system more inclusive but also more complex. There were 16 different classes of cedulas, each with rates ranging from 1.5 to 25 pesos, reflecting different social or economic statuses. Interestingly, certain groups like priests, soldiers, and other privileged individuals were exempt from paying these taxes, categorized under the gratis class. After 1884, the system shifted again. An annual tribute was imposed specifically on adult Filipino males, along with the same 40 days of forced labor, polo, per year. This tax mainly affected indigenous Filipinos, and unfortunately, it often led to widespread abuse by tribute collectors who exploited their positions. At that time, there was no standardized identity document system, which meant the collection process was often arbitrary and prone to corruption. Before 1884, the situation was different, and the reforms introduced in 1884 marked a significant turning point. These changes aimed to streamline and, in some ways, regulate the tribute and labor systems, but many issues persisted, especially in terms of abuse and inequality. So, in essence, the 1884 reforms reflected a transitional phase, partly modernizing the system, but still maintaining many of the oppressive elements that affected the Filipino people. Part 4 highlights how taxation and agrarian unrest played a major role in fueling revolts among Filipinos during the Spanish colonial period. One key event to focus on is the agrarian revolt that took place between 1745 and 1746. This uprising spread across several provinces, including Batangas, Laguna, Cavite, and Bulacan. These revolts were driven by the oppressed peasants who were unhappy with the heavy taxes and unfair land obligations imposed by the Spanish authorities. It's important to see how these issues of land and taxation were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of resistance. These uprisings reflect the deep-seated discontent among Filipinos with colonial policies that favored Spanish landowners and increased the burden on local farmers. Recognizing these events helps us understand the roots of Filipino resistance and the ongoing struggle for justice and autonomy during the colonial period. Let's take a closer look at the geographic spread of the revolt. It affected several towns such as Binyan, Imus, Silang, Cowit, and Bacoor, primarily in the southern parts of Luzon. Additionally, areas like San Mateo, Taguig, and Parañaque also felt the impact. The revolt didn't stay confined to one place. It spread to neighboring provinces, which shows how widespread the unrest was. In response to these disturbances, the colonial authorities quickly dispatched troops from Manila to places like Batangas. These encounters were often violent and bloody, but it's important to note that those who surrendered were eventually pardoned. This indicates that, despite the violence, there was a level of leniency and attempts at reconciliation. The government's response was quite severe, with riots erupting across the affected towns. There was extensive looting, especially targeting convents, and many churches and ranches were burned down. These acts of destruction highlight the intense anger and frustration among the people. Now, a critical point to understand is the role of the church. The Spanish priests refused to comply when demands were made for the return of lands they had seized. This refusal was a major catalyst for the unrest. The revolt's epicenter was in Lyon and Nasugbu in Batangas, where native landowners were furious about losing their ancestral lands to Catholic religious orders. They demanded that their lands be returned, which sparked the broader land seizure issue, essentially, the root cause of what we now call the agrarian revolt. So, in summary, this slide shows us how the revolt spread geographically, the government's tough response, and the critical issue of land and church authority that fueled the unrest. All of these points connect back to the larger theme of social and economic grievances that ignited the revolt. The agrarian conflicts had become significant enough to catch the attention of King Philip VI himself. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, he appointed Oidor Pedro Calderon Enriquez to lead an investigation. His task was to look into the charges against the religious orders and to verify whether their land titles were legitimate. This was a crucial step in addressing the broader issue of land disputes and asserting royal authority over land ownership. This investigation played a key role in the ongoing struggle between the Crown and the Church over land rights, which is a recurring theme in our discussion of colonial governance and land management. It highlights how conflicts over land weren't just local issues, but also matters of royal interest and policy. Despite losing at every level of appeal, the friars ultimately won their case and retained ownership of the disputed lands. Even after the end of the Spanish regime, the friars continued to hold onto these lands, ensuring that their ownership was preserved. This slide highlights the persistence of the friars through multiple appeals, including their appeal to the Royal Audiencia of Manila, which upheld the initial decision against them. The matter was further escalated to the Council of the Indies in Spain, which also confirmed the decision. It's important to note that, despite these setbacks, the friars refused to give up. They challenged the civil authorities by refusing to submit their titles to a secular judge, citing ecclesiastical exemption from civil authority. In response, the Governor-General took action and dispossessed the friars of the lands they allegedly usurped and held without legitimate title, returning these lands to the Crown. Before all this, King Philip VI had ordered an investigation, appointing Oidor Pedro Calderon Enriquez to examine the charges against the religious orders and determine the validity of their land titles. So, in the end, even though they faced many obstacles, the friars' resilience and legal efforts allowed them to retain their lands, shaping the overall narrative of their influence and authority during that period. The agrarian revolts of 1745 to 1746 clearly show us that Filipino resistance during the Spanish period was fueled not just by the heavy burden of taxes, but also by the loss of ancestral lands to powerful religious institutions. These two grievances, unfair taxation and land dispossession, were the main causes of unrest during colonial times and would continue to influence Philippine society even after Spain's rule ended in 1898. Now, when we look at the outcome of those revolts, it reveals a fundamental contradiction in Spanish colonial rule. Even when the highest courts in the empire ruled against the religious orders, the friars often still managed to win through legal tricks and their extensive institutional power. This ongoing struggle over land and authority didn't just disappear with Spanish colonization. It extended into the American period and became one of the most contentious issues in early 20th century Philippine history. So, the legacy of these agrarian revolts is quite significant. They highlight the persistent injustice faced by Filipinos, an injustice that was rooted in land loss and unfair taxation, and they remind us that these issues shaped the long struggle for justice and sovereignty in the Philippines. The 1745–1746 agrarian revolts taught us an important lesson. Land dispossession by religious orders was just as powerful a grievance as taxation itself. In fact, the dispute over friar lands was so persistent that it outlasted Spanish rule, showing how deeply rooted these issues were in Filipino resistance. Moving forward to the Reform era, the Royal Decree of March 6, 1884 marked a significant shift. It abolished the tribute, introduced the cedula personals, which essentially meant personal identification, and reduced forced labor from 40 days to just 15 days. This was a major change in colonial tax policy, aiming to ease the burden on Filipinos. Historically, resistance to unjust taxation was a recurring theme. From the revolts in Cagayan and Dingras in 1589 to Malong's uprising in 1660, Filipinos repeatedly took up arms to oppose unfair taxes. These uprisings pressured the Spanish authorities to reform the system over time. Now let's look at the Spanish colonial tax system itself. It was quite complex, comprising several different types of taxes: the tribute, sanctorum, donativo, caja de comunidad, and servicio personal. Each of these served specific fiscal and administrative purposes, creating a layered and often burdensome system for the Filipino people. So, to sum up, during the Spanish period, taxation was a central issue that sparked resistance and reform. These historical struggles highlight how economic and land disputes fueled Filipino resistance, ultimately shaping our path toward independence.